speak today. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here. So as you said kindly in your introduction, I'll share some of the findings of our research regarding the ultrasound-based endometrial receptivity test, which is abbreviated to USER, or user for short, and commercially available under the trademark name Matris. So just as a brief overview of our discussion topics for today, I'd like to go through some of the background information on the endometrium and the current standard of care for IVF treatment cycles in terms of endometrial thickness and pattern assessments. And then I'll introduce the user test in terms of what it is, what the recommendations are, and a few pieces of published data relating to some of the more frequently asked questions that we get about user testing. From there, I'll go over the results of our recently published retrospective chart analysis on the utility of user testing in a real-world clinical setting. So in the context of a natural fertile reproductive cycle, the endometrium responds to reproductive hormones originating in the ovary and in the pituitary in a cyclic manner. So in oversimplified terms, the events in the ovary leading to the growth of healthy ovulatory follicles, which in turn produce estrogen, facilitates the growth and proliferation of the endometrial tissue over a number of days early in the cycle. So the ovulation event and the accompanying hormonal changes shift the endometrium from this proliferative growth phase to a more mature, stabilized, differentiated mid-secretory phase. This mid-secretory phase is believed to represent well-prepared receptive endometrium and is targeted in IVF cycles for timed embryo transfer. So we have tools and technology available to assess the uterine cycle and the endometrial health, like hysteroscopy, biopsy, and the downstream histological or lab-based gene detection methods and multiple types of imaging. Of the tools and technology that we have available to examine endometrium, ultrasound has become fundamental and widely used, which makes a lot of sense. Excuse me, it's relatively non-invasive and can provide information rapidly. So if we focus in on what's going on with the endometrium, patients often undergo ultrasound monitoring with endometrial thickness assessments to determine the proliferative status of the endometrium. And generally speaking, there's a target thickness of around 7 millimeters that tends to be preferred. And once achieved, medications are adjusted to move the endometrium forward for embryo transfer. So the question at this point becomes, is the endometrial thickness telling us everything we need to know about the quality of the endometrial preparation? Or is there room to complement these thickness measurements with additional receptivity metrics with the goal of improving odds of success for the patient? So the results of the study that we'll discuss today suggest that we can, in fact, complement the standard of practice to achieve that goal. Which brings us to introduce the user test. So this test is a non-invasive ultrasound-based diagnostic tool that was designed to assess endometrial receptivity in advance of each considered embryo transfer. So the test identifies endometria that are optimally receptive, and equally important, it identifies endometria that are associated with a lower probability of pregnancy or poorly receptive. So it's suitable for use in both fresh and frozen cycles. And ultimately, the goal is to provide a reliable rationale for the decision to proceed to embryo transfer or not. The ultrasound imaging is done for user testing 2 days prior to the anticipated embryo transfer. And what happens is there's a series of transverse images taken of the uterus. And similarly to what would be done with a biopsy or a blood sample, those images are sent away to a computer lab for analysis. So instead of going to a reference lab like they would for a biological sample, they're going to go to a computer lab. And once the images arrive in the lab, they're processed through the user software platform. There's a multi-tiered computational workflow and scoring algorithm that the images pass through, and then a receptivity score is assigned. Those scores are then reported back to the clinic within about 24 to 36 hours. And the timing interval between the testing and the anticipated transfer is important because if the endometrium is identified as a deficient or suboptimal environment and a deferral of the transfer is recommended, it allows enough time to ensure that the lab can accommodate those embryos and make sure that they go into storage for use in a later cycle. So as I was saying earlier, ultrasound has become a fundamental part of assisted reproductive therapies. So clinics are often accustomed to using ultrasound for follicle monitoring, guided oocyte retrieval, taking endometrial thickness and pattern assessments, and guiding the embryo transfer. And it does all of these things incredibly well. With this high utility, it can be easy to think of these fundamental procedures as the limits of the technology. But these tasks are truly not the limits. There's an extensive depth of informative data in ultrasound echo texture that can be extracted with skill and with purpose-built computational tools. So the user test is a purpose-built computational tool that expands on the existing utility of ultrasound within the clinic to accurately determine the receptivity of the endometrium in advance of each anticipated embryo transfer. The user scores are then assigned based on over 40 metrics of data that are extracted from these endometrial ultrasounds. So which brings us to the clinical recommendations for user scores. So the scoring system is on a 10-point scale, with 0 being the lowest receptivity and 10 being the highest possible receptivity. Scores between 7 and 10 are considered optimally prepared endometrial environments, and the recommendation is to proceed to embryo transfer. Scores of 5 or lower are considered deficient, and they have a very low probability of supporting pregnancy. So the recommendation in this category is to defer the embryo transfer for a day when the endometrium is better prepared. Scores between 5 and 7 are considered suboptimal, and often what occurs in this category is that there's a mix of both optimal and deficient features the algorithm identifies, and the probability of pregnancy in this category is still quite a bit lower than the optimal category. So again, the recommendation is to defer the transfer in this case. So one of the first questions that's often asked is if there is a recommendation for a deferral, how likely is that recommendation to occur? And so what we've got here across the board with all of the clinics in our database is about a 25% deferral rate. About a quarter of scores will come back with the recommendation for postponement of the transfer. So the next question that we usually get from there is this user score any different from an endometrial thickness measurement? And the data that we have to address this question was presented at ASRM last year. So what we did here was a regression analysis to see if there's any correlation between endometrial thickness and user score. And we did this using cycle data from all of the cycles in our database, which have outcomes on file. And that was about 2,274 cycles. So in this graphic here, what we have is a representation of the user score on the vertical axis and its correlation with the endometrial thickness on the horizontal axis. And each spot on this graph represents an individual patient cycle. And where that spot falls on the graph tells us what kind of a user score they received and the endometrial thickness they had that day. So just as a couple of examples, if we were to look at this spot here, what we'd see is that this individual had a user score of 7.5, which is recommended for transfer, and they had an endometrial thickness of around 12 millimeters. Similarly, this individual had a thickness again of around 12 millimeters, but their user score was 4.5, which would be recommended for deferral. So when we did a regression to see how these two parameters are related, the R-square statistic that came out of it was a value of 0.3, which is by definition a negligible correlation. So the answer to the initial question is that user scores and endometrial thickness measures are fundamentally different. So the next frequently asked question that I'd like to go over is, does this test accurately identify low probability endometriosis? And the answer, again, for this question was yes, based on data gathered from those same over 2,000 cycles that were presented at ASRM last year. So the patient demographics showed us that low user scores affect patients equally. There's no difference statistically among patient demographics in individuals who receive high transfer recommended user scores or those who receive low deferral recommended user scores. So then what we did was we looked at cycle outcomes when the user scores were below the threshold for transfer, but the transfer proceeded against recommendation. And here there was a very clear trend line showing that with each decreasing point value in user score, there was a statistically significant drop in the probability of pregnancy. So based on this data, when user scores are below 7, it is a statistically significant predictor of the outcome, not pregnant. So at this point, I'd like to go into the retrospective chart review, the results that we've got on file for today. So this chart review was conducted with every patient that came through our partner clinic in the year 2018. This was all comers, and there was 1,521 individuals considered in this study. So in the user group, there were 316 individuals. And if they received a user score of 7 or higher and were recommended for transfer, they proceeded to single embryo transfer. If the score was below 7 and deferral was recommended, then the cycle was postponed and the embryo was conserved for a later date. For the standard of care comparator group, there was 1,205 individuals that underwent standard endometrial thickness and pattern assessments, and then the decision to proceed to transfer was made on a case-by-case basis. So if we look at the pregnancy rates for this patient population in aggregate, meaning fresh and frozen cycles on a per transfer basis, what we saw was a 12% higher pregnancy rate in the user group compared to the standard of care. And it's important to note that both the standard of care group and the user group had the same proportion of fresh embryo transfers and frozen embryo transfers, with about 3/4 being frozen embryo transfers and the remaining 1/4 being fresh. So when we broke down what happened on a fresh versus frozen basis, we saw that the user group had about a 9.4% higher pregnancy rate than standard of care in frozen embryo transfers. And when we looked at what was going on with fresh embryo transfers, the user group had about a 20% higher pregnancy rate than the standard of care group. So this is the last data slide that I have for you today. On the left here is a summary of the data that we've discussed so far in terms of pregnancy rates in each group and noted by cycle type. But what I wanted to draw your attention to is this last column in the graphic, because this is another metric that we do monitor very carefully. And this is the conservation of embryos. So in the user group, in this particular study, we had a 22.1% deferral rate by comparison to the standard of care, which is about a 1.5% deferral rate. Meaning that through the deferral of these low probability cycles, 64 embryos were conserved for later use in this study that otherwise would have been placed into low probability endometrial environments. So what we're doing now is trying to untangle what happens with these embryos and what their likelihood of going on to establish pregnancies in subsequent cycles is. So just to wrap up, these are the take-home messages. The user test is a real-time diagnostic tool designed to assess endometrial receptivity in advance of each embryo transfer, and it accurately identifies cycles with a low probability of supporting pregnancy. About 25% of cycles tend to be recommended for deferral, but subsequent cycles can achieve higher scores with adjustments to the protocol. So our retrospective analysis on over 1,500 cycles showed a statistically significant higher pregnancy rate when user-based cycle selection was utilized. And finally, the accurate identification of low probability cycles provides the opportunity to conserve embryos for use in subsequent cycles with better prepared endometria. So with that, I can take any questions you may have.